Welcome to the Redacted Culture Cast for Friday, the 24th of March, 2023. If you're a regular listener, I apologize for getting this one out a little bit later in the day. It needed a little bit of extra time to finish what we're talking about. If there were to be a title, it would be What Constitutes a Man? And this talks about categorization and how do we look at different peoples, different types of peoples, and the tension between this value that we have that all people are equal, but when we look out into the world, that's certainly not, well, it's not as obvious. Let's put it that way. Business first. Thank you very much for your support so far. We are rolling along with what comes out on Locals, which would be redactedculture.locals.com. You can support the channel there. I really do greatly appreciate it. That drive is starting to grow this podcast and this show and what we produce into a much more self-sustaining project. That being said, we are launching. Well, season 1, Operation 2 is actually live. Many people are already on the trail. I have on the screen here, if you're watching on YouTube, the what our website looks like right now, with the hints and the reference to season 1, Operation 2, Into Beasts. Ethan Walters is joining us Monday, also known as Gypsy Walters. He will be joining the show Monday to talk about not only a little bit of what went on behind Into Beasts or season 1, Operation 2, but we also talk a little bit about a little bit more of the gritty sides of Americana and how he's come from a background in tattooing and all this kind of stuff. So we're going to, well, I look forward to it because I think it was an excellently done conversation, how gun culture is expanding outside of simply what's in the gun safe. So that being said, on to the show. This one is going to sound a little bit more maybe scripted because it is. I had to write it out. There is one reference to one book, and that is Anarchy, State, and Utopia by Robert Nozick. It's on the screen right now if you want to see it. But Anarchy, State, and Utopia is a fundamental and foundational work of nonfiction written by Robert Nozick, identifying perhaps one of the most intellectual arguments for a politically successful form of libertarianism. But it should be looked at. It's definitely worth a read. It's hard to read. It's technical, but if you're on the edge of reading, and I should probably put out more content in regards to books, considering the background as a library. But if I can give one piece of advice when it comes to reading, is if you're reading a book that is difficult and seems just beyond your comprehension, you're probably dealing with the right book. If you can read a book and you're immediately bored by it, I mean, that's up to you, but I think I have learned the most when reading a book that was just on the edge of my comprehension capability. That being said, let us begin. What constitutes a man? A primary value which resides at the foundation of American gun culture is the idea that men are equal in value on metaphysical value, or on the metaphysical level. This axiom, often argued for, is not obvious. We live so comfortably in the West, or the successful integration of these values have so firmly integrated into our culture that activists and illiterates present activists and illiterates have permeated or use it as a ontological cudgel of moral implication to pillage nearby villages. Let me restate that. This axiom that all men are of equal metaphysical value is so ingrained into our culture and so integrated into our society that activists and illiterates use it as an ontological cudgel of moral implication in order to pillage nearby villages. And that idea that we hold these ideas, this idea that there are things called rights, and the idea of rights is grounded in an idea of equal metaphysical value. The fact that we have people using terms like rights on so many layers can be understood as evidence that if you're looking for optimism, we have achieved some sense of saturation, social saturation when it comes to the idea of rights. So whether Western culture takes this axiom for granted, or if it has functionally abandoned the foundation, cannot be determined on the national scale. But for us as individuals, one can reflect on what they believe to be true and then adjust their lives to better live it. Thesis: the concept or axiom that men are created equal or on a level playing field in regards to metaphysical value is not reflected in either nature or history, but must be grounded in something else. While we do not make distinctions, this is now beginning. While we do not make distinctions between people in regards to race, while we do not make distinctions between people in regards to metaphysics, we do in cultural ways, tribes, gangs, governments. We do in biological or ethnic ways, the Caucasians, the Asians, etc. We do so in other ways, such as the good guys, the Übermensch, the laity, the proletariat, the students. These categories are mostly descriptive and mostly categorized based on observed characteristics. In modal logic, the term necessary refers to a premise or preposition which is true in all possible worlds. It is through this that we may understand a key difference between law and morality. Man's laws are the creation of man, and moral laws which govern the universe are the creation of God. And since God is unchanging, omnipotent, or by the fact that effectively each person has a God, which is whatever sits at the top of their hierarchy of values, then we can say that moral laws are derived by that which tops the hierarchy of values, and thus are necessary. The argument goes like this: all people live by and have a hierarchy of values by which they live by. That hierarchy, that choice between to do A or B may be conscious and it may not be recognized. I may be able to list out a series, or I may be able to write out a series of hierarchies or a series of elements within my hierarchy of value, but whether or not I am capable of seeing it, I as an individual live by a hierarchy of values because I act and make choices. And whatever sits at the top of my hierarchy of values, whether I acknowledge it or not, that thing is functionally my God. And that thing being at the top of my hierarchy of values implies that there is a measure by which these things are evaluated, and therefore the existence of there being a measure is a modally necessary element. By the sheer fact that people make decisions, morality is necessary. There is a necessary element to morality. Morality is modally necessary. Whether we can observe it or not is an entirely different argument. So each individual has a hierarchy of values. Does this hold? Space and time demand it, potentiality as well. This then implies that morality is closer to the foundation than legality, moral greater than legal. Or, when ordered correctly, that which is moral should be the foundation of that which is legal. Legality is not necessary, but morality is. Therefore, as people, not only should, but also do we not the same. Therefore, we as people not only should, but also inherently pursue what we believe to be moral over what we perceive to be legal. We cannot help it. By this, though, the law may make by this, though the law may make a distinction, say, between male and female, Jew or Gentile, slave or free, agent or cult member, military or civilian, we do not make a moral distinction between the two on the grounds of their being. This is not accomplished by observing and categorizing the physical attributes of people. It implies that there is more to a man than flesh and blood. So when it comes to violence, We know that there is a difference between the moral and the legal. It is said that, and now let me be clear. It is said that a government is a monopoly on violence. And you may have heard that governments have a monopoly on violence, or likely something similar. This phrase, although emotionally satisfying to the downtrodden, lacks an effective correlation to reality. As Nozick points out in Anarchy, State, and Utopia, the preposition or claim that it is an essence of government to be a monopoly on violence can be violated in two ways. One, extra legal violence, or two, a non-violent claim to authority can be made by a non-state actor or party. So what Robert Nozick is saying is that it is not appropriate, it is not sufficient to refer to a monopoly of violence as a government. And this is a window into the specificity of his writing. When Robert Nozick wrote about this idea of the government, of an essence of government being a monopoly of violence, he is saying that it is not true that you can determine a government, or a thing is determined to be a government by its monopoly on violence, because a government or a state may not be the one acting violent. There may be somebody or something inside, i.e. an insurgency, or there may be people within that state who are claiming the authority of the state, perhaps even arguing effectively for it, in such a way to challenge the hegemony of the state. And both of these could exist in possible worlds, therefore denying it to being a definitional element of a state or government to be a monopoly on violence. It is not simple enough to say that which has the monopoly of violence is therefore the state. Again, yay for specificity. From this, we end up facing a fork in the road. Either one, a government is a monopolization of legal violence, or two, the morality regarding the use of force is dependent on something other than the state. Well, actually, the fork isn't really there. It's a false dichotomy. Both can be true. The morality regarding the use of force is dependent on something other than the state, is not necessarily exclusive. It does not necessarily exclude the possibility that the state is something that we refer to as a monopolization on legal force, unless legal should make room for moral applications outside of the state's choice. Since the state is constituted of people, however, that places it as a whole and as individuals as subject to the moral law. There should be no distinction between the state and non-state actors when it comes to the moral application of violence. Do not be misguided and think that this implies that when the state or state actors abuse their power through violence, that it enables all subjects of that state to do the same, without concern for who, what, where, when, or how. The same goes for people within a state. The moral nihilism which places the self or outcome first and morality far later condemns the individual to a moral bankruptcy no victory can assuage. Instead, the application of violence may take into consideration the categories of people as well as the methods of categorization for who, what, where, how, and when violence may be applied, but not if or will it be the moral factor. The descriptors of a human may determine the methods or appropriate context by which violence is understood, but it does not make it moral or immoral. That is an important distinction. That is determined by an equal moral plane between peoples. It is not because the act of violence was between one person of one ethnicity and a person of another ethnicity which makes the action moral or immoral. Rather, such factors are descriptors of the violence, not the determining factor. This does not negate situations where violence is committed on the basis of these factors, but rather this is the action which condemns them. If you use a person's ethnicity as justification for violence, it is the moral code which condemns that on the basis of it being an insufficient or improper moral criteria for the application of violence. So, when we look out into the world and observe the many differences there are between peoples, we see the exact place where the moral exists, the common humanity. And that reality reveals not only that the legal framework is not absolute over morality, but it doesn't even have the power over people's actions. It is not the law which prevents a person from being violent, but it is that person's choice to adhere to it. As this applies to all people, it is not the state. Oh, well, sorry, a written typo, I guess. It is ultimately choice, therefore. No, that's not even it. It is ultimately choice. Violence is not the framework, but exists within a framework. And that framework is our worldview, which closely resembles metaphysics. And if we hold to the idea that people are of metaphysically equivalent value, we hold that there is no meaningful distinction over bearing arms. It is only after forfeiting a right that such recourse may be required. So, this is that ultimate grounds. The very morality, the very fact that we do not make distinctions between soldier and civilian or citizen or an American, the very fact that we do not hold a metaphysical differentiation of value between state and non-state actors is the very fact that we believe people are equal is the very fact that we believe people are equal is the very thing which determines that individuals have the right to bear arms. And so, if you want to be very clear, you could very easily make the conclusion that people who do not believe that individuals have the right to bear arms do not believe people of equivalent value and are thus tyrants. So, in conclusion, do not ask for a tyrant's permission to act moral. Do not ask for a tyrant's permission to act moral. Instead, do what is right because it is right. That is the end of the writing of this section. I know it was necessary for me, or it was needed, not necessary. It was not modally necessary, but it was needed. It was important for me to be able to write this out in order to be as clear as I possibly can in what I am saying. Is that our worldview, how we think of the world, is the context by which we make moral decisions within the world, and that context informs us. If we believe that people are equal, if that people are people, human beings have value being human beings, then we understand that it is their immutable characteristics which cannot be used to what is it called, serve as the basis for violence. We also recognize that there is no meaningful distinction on this level between peoples. There might be some meaningful differences because when we talk about all people being equal, I think that we regularly struggle between it being a value to pursue or a moral axiom. So that being the case, I am going to close off this Friday early because we're getting this episode out late. But that being said, I look forward to hearing from you. If you're looking for a book to read that will challenge you, I do recommend Anarchy, State, and Utopia. It's not an easy one to read through. That being the case, this is the Redacted Culture Cast for Friday, the 24th of March, episode 66, Worldview. Take care.